All right. So welcome back to Brown Bag History, back to our fall season. As we start today, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is the Sinixt homeland and traditional territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Ktunaxa to this land. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land, sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. And I encourage you to take part in the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation this on the 30th. The local Indigenous Friendship Society has lots of events planned. Those are, you can find out about those in the paper and on social media. So today we're talking about the 60 years of the Revelstoke Museum in this community. It was 60 years ago this June that they opened their first location. So I thought it was worth celebrating that and looking at our own history. So it goes back to 1958. That was the BC centennial year. So it was the 100th anniversary of the creation of the Crown Colony of British Columbia. And so there were a lot of celebrations going on throughout the province. And it sort of really brought people to realize that their own history wasn't really being recorded, especially within the smaller communities. So a lot of that was here, a lot of museums or a lot of historical associations started. And the Revelstoke and District Historical Association started that year. That was the original name that our Museum Association went by. And so they formed on November 23rd, 1958, with their 10 local citizens met, and they decided to form a society. And in the paper it said, as our centennial year nears its close, we are reminded that we must carry on with our historical past and perpetuate for future generations the work and efforts of our pioneers in building this great country of ours. And so they mentioned that the local teachers had put on a historical display at the high school, and it showed the level of interest in the history of the area. So this group decided to form. They met in the council chambers, and their first temporary officers were George Laforme, whose father had been an early packer and miner in this area, and A.E. State as vice president, Estelle Dickey as secretary, Jim Corrigan as treasurer, and others present at the meeting were Dr. Hugh Mackay, Ruby Nobbs, Mr. Truck, Lloyd Benison, Bruce Harvey, and Stan Manning. So that was the nucleus of the group that eventually formed what we have now as the museum. Their early meetings, they were talking about topics of local history, and they were encouraging the members to bring as much information as they could. And one of the first things they did was acquire a filing cabinet and started filing information that they were compiling and getting together on different historic parts of the local history, like the Big Bend and the history of the Columbia River. And they were even wanting to, they were sending letters to the provincial government asking about having significant sites marked with monuments. And one of the sites that they were looking at was Priest Rapid, which is just north of Downey Creek and just below the former area known as Death Rapids. There had been a tragic accident there in 1838 when the first missionaries were coming through. The missionaries had made it down to Arrowhead. Another boat had gone back to boat encampment to pick up the remaining people, but on the way down, the boat overturned at what became known as Priest Rapids, and several people died. And they were actually wanting to have some marking put at those sites, and also at Arrowhead, where some of the people had been buried, and also where there were recognized Indigenous burials at Arrowhead as well. So that was one of the things they were trying to get going. That never happened, but they were quite active in really trying to acknowledge, find out and acknowledge the history of this region. They began collecting artifacts even before they had a place to store them. The city hall was allowing them some space in the basement of the city hall. In our artifact registration and in our database, this is our very first artifact. It's you can see it says 60.1. When we accession artifacts, we start with the year. When they first started, they were using a 2-digit year, but we have hopes of continuing the museum for more than 100 years, and we're already up into 2023. So now we use a 4-digit year. But the first part of that accession number indicates the year. The second part indicates the accession, or the group of material that it came in with. Sometimes there will be a single object in an accession, as in this case. If there had been more, there would have been 60.1.1, 60.1.2. We do that. That's our standard accessioning now. Even if there's only one item brought in, it still has that third number. That's sort of that's collections standards. This could come apart, so it had A and B as well. But it came from the church at Arrowhead. So that was the very first artifact that was collected and accessioned. And right from the beginning, they were properly recording things. They didn't have all of the materials that we have now, so some of the numbers weren't written on in this what's now standard, but they were keeping records. They had paper forms. They had card catalogs where they would actually you put things by categories, by donor, so right from the very beginning, they were keeping records of what was being brought in. This was the second item. It was a cardboard dress pattern from the 1890s, donated by Mrs. Noah Hall of Hall's Landing. And the third item was a writing notebook that belonged to Edith Jowett from the Trout Lake School in 1895. Edith was the daughter of Alice Jowett, who was a successful miner and the owner of the Windsor Hotel at Trout Lake, and pretty much a legend in the Trout Lake area. So those are really significant artifacts. As you can see, they're still in our collection and are being cared for well. So another thing that right from the beginning, they were trying to look for a space where they could open a public museum. It took them until 1963 to be given space. They were given a little basement room in the public health unit building, which is at, it's at 110 Mackenzie Avenue. And the first museum opened in their basement. So they were in the process of getting that ready. They started off by doing this article in the paper written by Mary Dame. And she was talking about, this is just before the museum started. This is June 6th. And she was really encouraging people to be aware of the museum, that it was going to start. And Mary was a really brilliant writer. She was a published author of children's books, and she has a really lovely, unique style. So she had started this article off by saying, "Who was the owner of the pair of York iron boots found in the basement of the Regent Hotel? Were they part of a home exercising set, or had they some other use? And how in the world would you ever start the fearsome looking gas chainsaw? These and many other questions are going to be asked when you visit Revelstoke's soon-to-open historical museum. It will be in the basement of the health center and is reached from the back entrance." And she went on to say, "A museum for Revelstoke is not a new idea. It has always been a matter of lack of space, not enthusiasm. And nothing like this is achieved without a good deal of hard work. What we have to show you may not be ideal, but it is the very best we can obtain in the way of quarters. And since so many public-spirited citizens have given of their time and their varied talents, we need make no apologies." But she does go on to say, and I love this because this is really, museums have to have a collections policy, so what they want to accept. And we have a collections policy that really focuses on this local area. But I've never heard it articulated as well as Mary Dame did in this article. She said, this is intended to be a historical museum. We want donations, but we would prefer some local tie-in. The ostrich egg, Great Auntie Meg, sent from Australia, will have to be declined. But if you've the tin lunch bucket Great Grandpa used when he worked on the sections, we'd like to have it. We would prefer outright donations. They'll have the best care we can give them, be cataloged, and the name of the donor be put on them if you wish. And we would like to know as much about your gift as you were able to tell us. Old photographs and maps are amongst our wants, but not old books unless they pertain to this district. And that's still pretty much our collections policy right there. We collect within the district. So it's north to Boat Encampment, south to Trout Lake, and down as far as like Halcyon and St. Leon Hot Springs, east to Rogers Pass, or actually to Donald, and west to Sycamoose, or actually Malaqua, a bit of overlap there. So she basically really articulated well what our collections policy is still now. She said, now, has anyone an elderly beer keg, a man's pipe, or any mementos of the cigar factory which used to be here? Is there in your back shed a three-wheeled bicycle, or is anyone a kettle old enough to settle down in comfort beside the fireplace now in our possession? We'll need people willing to act for an hour or two as attendants, and the hours of opening and duties are still to be settled. No admission will be charged, but we are not going to turn down donations. See you in the museum soon, and not as an artifact. And she talked about the York iron boots, and these are the York iron boots in our collection. But what I found interesting is that I went looking for these in our database and was expecting them to be cataloged in 1962 or 1963. But the date on them is 1975. And I'm going to explain a little bit in a minute about what happened leading up to 1975 and how it caused some problems in our collection. But I was able to go into the database, and based on this information from Mary Dame's article from 1963, I was able to add in where they had come from, because that had gotten lost over the years, that information that they'd been found in the basement of the Regent Hotel, and that they were mentioned in an article in 1963. So I was actually very excited that I was able to find that bit of information and add it to our current database. So this is Joris and Mary Dame. They were among the early members and volunteers of the Revelstoke and District Historical Association. Joris had been born in Revelstoke and brought up here. He worked on the railway. And Mary was, as I say, was a published children's author, and also wrote a lot of published magazine articles and newspaper articles as well. And Mary was the first registrar. And we have her original notes that she took. And because she was a writer, sometimes her descriptions are embellished and quite lovely to read, actually. I really like reading her original records. But you can see in here some of the artifacts in this photograph, and most of these are still in our collection. There's a little stained glass window that came from Mount Stephen House at Field. That's on display downstairs. Of course, we have the picture of the driving of the last spike. There's some little pieces from the Central Hotel that are in our collection. And there's this little piece at the bottom, like somebody with his thumb on his nose. And that's actually a cigar cutter from the Union Cigar Factory, which was a local business. There was a local cigar factory here. So it's interesting to look at that photograph and recognize so many of the artifacts in it, and really acknowledge the work that Mary and Joris did. So this was the building that was opened as the Public Health Center in 1955 at 110 Mackenzie Avenue. And the first museum was in the basement. So it actually opened to the public on June 20th, 1963. and they were open from 3 to 5 p.m. and 7 to 9 p.m. Monday to Saturday. And as I say, they were already collecting artifacts. Ruby Nobbs, who is one of the original members, wrote a little history in the 70s. And she said that basically they ran out of room the day they moved in. It was never really appropriate lodging for the museum. But they were there for 11 years before they were able to get this building that we're in now. So here's a few more of the early artifacts that were cataloged in the early days in 1962. These were gold scales that came out of the Imperial Bank. And then in 1963, the Imperial Bank, which is now where the CIBC is, was a beautiful old brick building. It was being torn down. So they were able to acquire a fireplace mantle, which we still have, and the fireplace insert, which we still have in our collection, and teller's wicket from the bank as well. They acquired a pack saddle, which had belonged to Andrew Westerberg, known locally as Ole the Bear. He had delivered the mail up the Big Bend by skis and snowshoes or pack horse in the summer for over 30 years. He was kind of a local legend. So we have that. That's currently on display downstairs. There was a donation of a 1904 calendar from the C.B. Hume General Store, which it opened in 1903, where the Royal Bank is located now. And that was actually donated by Emily Hume, who was the widow of C.B. Hume. This is kind of a little favorite mustache cup, this very fancy little teacup that had a little lip there so that you could drink your tea and not get the tea on your mustache. And again, that came in 1964. So by July of 1963, more than 200 artifacts and photographs had been donated. And by August 22nd of 1963, there had been more than 1,650 visits. A lot from Revelstoke and from all over BC and the Prairie Provinces in Ontario, several US states, and United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Australia. They just stayed open for 4 months the first few years. In 1966, the city's first motorized fire truck, 1923 Bickle International truck, was turned over to the Historical Association by the city. They rented a garage for storage. And then when the fire department moved into their current location and opened a little museum there, the fire truck was turned over to the fire department. And they still bring it out for the parades every year. Now I'm going to talk about something that was known as Columbia Village. And this is where the history of the museum gets a little bit murky. There was discussions with the provincial government and Bob Broadland, who is the historic sites officer, as early as 1964. The Historical Association actually approached Dr. Hugh Keenley's side of BC Hydro with the query about creating a heritage park at Revelstoke to house museum artifacts, as well as to collect artifacts and structures that were going to be in the flooded areas. So they began discussions with the Historic Sites Officer, Bob Broadland, but things, it's government, so things move very slowly. In September of 1968, the Department of Recreation, BC Hydro, agreed on a 12-acre site on the former Calder Farm in the Big Eddy near the Tonkawa or Tum Tum River. By that time, many of the buildings marked for preservation had already been burned. But the government had a steel storage shed erected on the Calder Farm property in the spring of 1970. And Bob Broadland named the project Columbia Village. The former Northwest Mounted Police Barracks had been given to the association, It had sat on another farm for many years, and it was dismantled log by log and rebuilt at Columbia Village. This is the Northwest Mounted Police Barracks in this photograph. It had originally been at the top of Douglas Street Hill, and we've talked about the Farwell Police War when the Northwest Mounted Police was having a battle with the provincial police over liquor sales. So it was significant building, even though the West Mounted Police were only there for about a year. It was later used for churches for several denominations and for the first schoolhouse. So it had a significant history to it. So it was moved onto the site. This was the barracks when it was on the Griffiths farm prior to being moved to the Columbia Village site. So they put a lot of work into that one. This was the storage shed that was erected in 1970. They also brought in the old kiosk, which was originally at the CPR station, and then had been moved to the parking lot near the co-op store where City Furniture is now, and had been used as a visitor information booth for several years. And it was brought over there as well. They also had a dredge that had been used on the Columbia River and the Arrow Lakes, and was put by the water on that site, but it was badly vandalized. I think every bit of copper and brass was removed from it. It was pretty much stripped bare. But the province still said that they were on board with Columbia Park or Columbia Village, and in 1972 it was declared a Class A park. Premier Dave Barrett toured the site in 1973 and indicated that help would be forthcoming, that the project would move forward, but that never happened. In 1975, the Historical Association was asked to remove artifacts from the storage area, and many were brought into the museum with little or no documentation. Others were sent to other heritage sites within the province, as well as to Three Valley Gap. On November 13th, 1980, a provincial order was issued by the Minister of Lands, Park and Housing, canceling Columbia Village Historic Park as a Class A park, and indicated that it was determined to be in the public interest to transfer the administration and control of the area to the regional district of Columbia Shuswap, because in 1980, Big Eddy was still in the regional district. It wasn't included in the city boundaries until the fall of 1981. But so it was, the local association put a lot of effort into that. They gathered a lot of artifacts there. When the artifacts were moved over here, they didn't have the same level of documentation that the earlier collection had, the local collection. I think there were things moved over there from the museum because they didn't have enough room, and they just kind of got, their history got misplaced, like those pair of York iron boots that I was showing you. They ended up with a 1975 number, even though we know now that they were donated at least as early as 1963. So it actually still causes collections problems for us now. We're still trying to fix some of those errors, and we still have a lot of artifacts that don't have the level of documentation that they should have had. So it was a good idea. I think it was meant to be sort of in the same level as Fort Steele and Barkerville as a provincial historic park. But the political will was never really there to really get it off the ground. So it kind of foundered. Everything that was there was finally removed. The storage shed was finally removed. So it kind of just faded away. But in the meantime, by 1974, the city had been negotiating with the federal government to take over the former post office and customs building here at 315 First Street West. And their purpose right from the beginning was to acquire it for a museum. And so they finally were, and of course, again, we're working with levels of government. So it took a while for that agreement to come into being. But finally in July 12th, 1974, this building was taken over as the museum. At that time, this floor was being used by the art group for their art gallery. At that time, the museum didn't need the full space, so we had the first floor for artifacts and the storage, the basement for storage. So this was the opening day, July 12th, 1974. It was actually part of that was the 75th anniversary of, or that year was the 75th anniversary of the incorporation of the city of Revelstoke. So the city was having a big homecoming. And so the museum opening was part of the homecoming event. So there were a lot of people that came to see it, and I think people were pretty excited to finally have a proper home for the museum artifacts. This was one of their first advertising posters. And at that time, they were open from 2 to 9. And when I started working here in 1983, those were our hours still. It wasn't until later on that we changed that. We actually changed the hours because once they started doing the Summer Street Fest in about 1990, we weren't getting any evening traffic at all. So we decided that it made sense to just go to morning and afternoon hours at that point. So this was what the museum looked like originally. Because it was the old post office and they didn't remove any walls, when you'd come into the front, you'd be met with a wall, which is kind of right in the middle of where our first little glass gift shop case is now, in the middle of the floor. And then you would be directed down the hallway, which was a long, narrow hallway where the post office boxes used to be. And I still get people coming in and saying, my box was right about here. It was this number such and such. But they originally used that hallway for to put up historic photographs and a photograph display. So that was how the hallway was used. This was the interior of the museum. So the hallway is just on this side of this wall here. And so it sort of broke that up into space. So they had wooden shelves built in, and originally just nylon netting over them, which was really easy for people to pull apart or rip with a knife and take artifacts off of. And that happened more than once. So you can see they just had things sort of arranged by theme. There wasn't really any text there. There were no text panels. They put original photographs up. So things were just basically arranged by theme. And small bits of text, but it was mostly really focused on the artifacts. This kind of display is what you'd call as sort of visible storage, where you're sort of showing what you've got without really doing much interpretation. And you can see the nylon netting over there, which was still in place when I started working here in 1983. So this was a little bit later. This would be in the 1980s, but you can see, so here's the main door, and you'd come in here where our gift shop is now, but you were met with this door, right, or with this wall as soon as you came in. So there was really not any space for us to greet people at the front. If I'd heard the door open, I'd run to the front and say hi to people and direct them the way to go. But it made it really difficult to really run the museum that way. We felt like we were just still living in the post office. And this is where our office is now, and you can see it's a little parlor. This is where you'd come in and to the front door and turn right. We had some showcases in there, and for a while we had some cases that were provided by the local birders club with some taxidermy birds that they donated. Those little strips with the photographs were replaced by these heavy wooden showcases, which were, I don't know if there's another picture showing them. I'll get to that. But anyway, they were very difficult to, you'd open them from the bottom and pull them up to put the photographs in. And you really couldn't do it with less than 2 people. But I did it myself a few times, and I was sort of putting my life at risk, standing under this big heavy glass. Um, one year we had, before these cases were put in, the windows on Long Boyle Avenue were open. And one day I came into work, and a glass had been thrown through the little shot glass from one of the bar had been thrown through the window and into one of these glass panels, and it completely shattered the panel. There wasn't a piece of glass left, bigger than that. Um, so there was a lot of things we had to deal with that weren't ideal. Yeah, this is the little parlor area where the office is now, and we did have a little cash register up there for people who were coming in and making donations. And this is Ruby Nobbs and me. So I started working here in actually the winter of 1983. The city was hosting the BC Winter Games, and the museum got a little grant to do a little history display on sports in Revelstoke. So me and Gwen Eady were hired to do that. So that's when I started working here. And then that summer, the summer attendant that they'd had, who's an older lady, didn't want to do it anymore. So they asked me if I would be the attendant in the summer. And that's how it went on. At that time, we were only open in the summers. So, things have just really evolved from there. But Ruby she was one of the original members of the Historical Association back in 1958. And she had run the bowling alley, which she and her brother owned, or the cabin now. That opened in 1962, and she ran that until she sold it. And then when she retired, she decided that she wanted to focus all of her energies on the museum. So she became the museum manager, but it was a volunteer position. She was never paid for her work here, but she was my boss and my mentor. She had a steel trap memory. People think I have a good memory. Mine was nothing compared to hers. People would come in and say, oh, I'm looking for information on my grandmother. Her name was this. And Ruby said, oh yeah, she was 2 years ahead of me in school. And her brothers and sisters' names were this, and her parents' names were this. Her dad did this, and they lived on this house. Just like she didn't ever forget anybody that she'd never known in her entire life. It was really quite amazing. We have records in the early minutes about Ruby attending the BC Museums Association conferences going back to the 1960s. And so they were, she was involved on the provincial level as well, and that understanding of, how the province was operating. Bob Broadland, who had been behind the Columbia Park thing, was at always came to the meetings as well. And I think there might have been a little bit of resentment still over how Columbia Park had been handled, but she was very gracious about it, accepted that it just wasn't to be. So really put all of her efforts into making sure that the museum was really thriving. These are this is the hallway photo panels that I was telling you about. And you can see there was a little lock at the bottom, and you sort of lift them up from the bottom to put the photos in. Every year we'd try to do a different theme with the photos. This one is obviously heritage homes. So every year we do a different photo theme. So we'd have to get the photos copied and then get them mounted there. And of course, nothing was digital back then. I don't think we had a computer in the building until about 1999 or so. This was something that I still have school kids who are now in their 40s and 50s coming into the museum and saying, where are the bugs? Because we used to have this showcase full of insects that had been given to a local school teacher named Eva Byrne. How many here had Eva Byrne as a teacher? A few of you did. She was pretty formidable, but had a huge passion for natural science. And I've still heard from people who learned a lot about like animals and bugs and plants from Eva Byrne. So she'd acquired this collection, I believe, from somebody in Vancouver and used it in her classes. And then it was donated to the museum. And we had those on display for years. So I still have people saying, where are the bugs? But they're actually in boxes in the basement at the moment. We haven't had them on display for a while, partly because they were kind of deteriorating, being out on display for that long. This was some of the showcases. This would be in the 80s and 90s, some of our exhibits. So we're still doing themed exhibits. We're adding a little bit more text into them to try to put things into a little bit more context. A little kitchen display. It was, we were making increasingly better use of the artifacts that we had and giving people a chance to really see what we had. And you can see we're starting to add a little bit more. Sorry. Yeah, add a little bit more information into each panel as well. The first heritage walking tour, I think it was around 1988. I think just after they did the downtown revitalization, and I was taking a group on a tour for the first time. And we're still doing heritage walking tours now, and cemetery tours. And I think the cemetery tours probably started around the same time. Definitely in the late 80s, early 90s, we started doing the cemetery tours as well. And we still offer those. We just had over 100 people do the downtown walking tours this summer from June until now. And I've got Bill McFarlane as a tour guide as well. So the two of us are sharing that, which is great. Makes it easier to offer more tours. Again, some of the exhibits. Downstairs, this is the switchboard from the King Edward Hotel, and that's still in there now. But this is when this wall was still up between the hallway and the exhibit area. We did Victorian teas for several years. This is Jacqueline Daniluk, who I was her first boss back in, would have been in the 80s. And she is serving tea, and we're still friends now. She went on with a career in Parks Canada, but we did the little Victorian tea for several years as well. This is a cabinet that had come from Stock's photography studio, and for years we used it for displaying the CPR artifacts that we had. Now with the Railway Museum in town, we don't have that big of a railway collection or a display because it's covered so well at the Railway Museum. But of course, we mention it because it's such a huge part of why Revelstoke is here. The case was actually eventually transferred because it was just a bit too big and unwieldy for us to continue to use. In 1998, Ruby published her first book, Revelstoke History and Heritage. She was 91 years old at the time that was published and legally blind. So it was quite a process writing it. She had me and several other volunteers, including Elsie Jameson, who were writing down. She was writing the book out loud. She would speak the book, and one of us would write it down. I finally got her to let me agree to use my typewriter or my computer to type rather than just writing it all out by hand. But it was a long, involved process. But we still have this available for sale. We still use it as one of our major reference works. Really phenomenal that she was able to do that work. She published the second book just a few months before her death on railway history that was done for the Railway Museum. We've been in floats, not that often, but there's a couple here that we did. This is when my daughter, who's now 32, was in the parade with me. We had her in the old wicker buggy that we have, and there's Ruby. And then we did another float in 2001. So this is where our parlor display is now. That was our office until 2004. So it was never really adequate and away from the front entrance. So it was hard to be able to, communicate with people coming in. This is in 1999 for the centennial of Revelstoke. The local member of the Historical Association, Liz Barker, made this beautiful heritage home quilt. So she took images of several heritage homes and had them transferred to fabric and created that quilt based on that. And we raffled that as a raffle for the museum. And also in 1999 is the year that we were able to get control of the full building. The art group was asked to find other accommodations because we required more space to expand our area. So in 1999, the Ruby Knobs Community Archives was opened, and that's the room that you normally don't see, but it's right across the hallway, our archives room. And Ruby was quite delighted to have it named after her because it was a real tribute to all the work that she had done. So the other thing that we'd been looking at for quite a few years was how to make the outside of the property look nice as well and be a bit more, have a little bit more meaning. So because this had been built as a post office and customs, there was a delivery lane next to it. And this is the delivery lane in around the year 2000. And this was the area that we thought, well, let's build a garden there. We had a few people saying, that's not big enough for a garden. You don't get enough light. It's not going to work. But we made it work. So we worked with Barb Johnston Davidson, who's a landscape architect, and she prepared the plans for the garden. And there's Bob Brummett, who's a brick mason, working on the posts at the front of the garden in the spring of 2003. And those bricks came from the former CPR station, and the bricks at the back came from the old Queen Victoria Hospital. So we were able to incorporate that local history into the garden as well. There's the SPM landscaping, installing the bricks, and we're putting down the sod. There's Barb Davidson working, and a few of us helping to volunteer to put the sod down for the garden, which needs to be redone because it's pretty much all weeds now. Liddy Moore is one of our garden volunteers when they were doing the first planting of the garden. And then it opened in July of 2004 during a local homecoming. There's some of our long-term volunteers. And we still really rely heavily on volunteers. The garden is maintained by a volunteer group. At the moment, it's under it's Linda Dixon and Leslie Pernkey who on our board. They're the co-chairs of the garden committee. But there's been hundreds of hours of volunteer time put into keeping that garden such a beautiful downtown green space. So also in 2004 is the year when we did the renovations that basically turned us from a post office into a museum. And you can see on the floor, you can see where that wall had been there. It had angled through. So that wall was taken out. And the original terrazzo floor is still there. So we were able to maintain the floor. But we built this wall to create the front office space where that little parlor had been before. And so for the first time, we had a front office. And that was the year that we started actually charging admission. Before that, it had just been admission by donation. And we started with $4 for adults. And even now we're only up to $5 per adult. But this was what it gave us the opportunity to eventually turn that into where our gift shop is now. But we still had these case displays inside. But at this point, instead of entering the hallway from the front, you came into the main museum and then entered the hallway, but the hallway was still there. And then we had the slightly improved showcases with glass on them, at least. But it was still difficult to really tell a good story, and the cases were a little bit dark. So there were still challenges to deal with. We started to do some big events. In 2008, it was the 150th anniversary of the creation of the Crown Colony of BC. So the Royal BC Museum and BC Hydro partnered together to do something called the Free Spirit Conservation Tour. And they took it to a selected number of museums in the province. And we were one of the museums that they selected. So we were quite happy to have that. It came with this little show, that these group of actors were doing skits on BC history and on conservation. There was all sorts of exhibits as part of it, artifact exhibits and panels and all sorts of things like that. That's when we acquired the Nels Nelson cutout that we now have downstairs. It was part of that tour. The local Red Hat Ladies group came to participate in the tour. We had hundreds of people coming in. We had lots of pretty much all of the local school groups, as well as school groups from Nakusp and Salmon Arm and Sicamous coming for that. So it was quite exciting for us, and showed us, how we can do things differently here a bit too. In 2008, we did a major exhibit with the Railway Museum called Chinese Legacies, and I was asked to curate an exhibit on the Chinese railway workers on the railway. And so we decided that if I was going to do that, we would make it a joint exhibit. So the exhibit here would focus on the local Chinese community that developed after the railway had been completed. So this is part of the exhibit that we had here. When we opened it on August 16th, 2008, we had a lot of members of the Kwong family who were here. They were one of the early Chinese families, and it became a little bit of a reunion for them. And there's the Kwong clan there. The fellow at the front there, Jimmy, was the youngest son of Mr. and Mrs. Kwong, who were the early Chinese residents. And the group, the association members decided to put together some cookbooks as a fundraiser. So this was their first cookbook in 2008, and that one's completely sold out. But we have 3 others that they did afterwards, and that was a lot of fun with the group getting together and choosing recipes. And they actually were able to use old cookbooks in our collection that other groups had put together years ago as fundraisers. So it was kind of a bit of a historic work as well. In 2010, we had a picnic to mark the 125th anniversary of the Farwell town site. So we actually held it in Farwell Park, and had some old-fashioned games, and it had Peter Waters dressed up as the town crier. So that was a fun event. Also that year, I didn't include that in this talk. I'll probably include it in another one. We also, in 2010, we did a major commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the Rogers Pass snowslide on March 4th, 1910. But I'll include that in another talk. We've started running Heritage Explorers children's program in 1999 and continued that until last year. We didn't have the staffing or the space because we had our mushroom exhibit this year, so we didn't run it this year. We did a couple of beer and wings events in the Heritage Garden with Ron Kwong. Grew up here, moved to Vancouver, had a mobile catering business called Ping's Wings Wandering Walk. And he and his mom, Mary, would cook up dozens of wings for us. So we did that for a couple of years. Actually, Ron was just in today, as my next talk is going to be on Mannings. So he came to find out what I needed from him. So he's going to send me some stuff for the next talk. A couple of years, we did Chinese New Year's events held one here at the museum, and then at some of the local Chinese restaurants. The last couple were done at Kevin's Kitchen. We, on April 29th, 2011, we had a royal tea to celebrate the wedding of Prince William and Kate Middleton. I put together a little bit of an exhibit on royal history at that time as well, because Revelstoke had royal visits in the past. So we had fun with that. We were encouraging everybody to wear hats with fascinators. So everybody had fun dressing up for that one. In 2009, there was another local homecoming, and James Baring, who was the 6th Lord Revelstoke, came to Revelstoke for that. And we were able to show him the town that was named after his great-grandfather. And we had this exhibit called From Farwell to Revelstoke, which was one of our early sort of text-heavy exhibits with a lot of information in it. In 2012, we celebrated the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth, and Helen Grace did a little skit with me where she played the Queen. I think she's only about 6 months younger than the Queen, and had a special cake made, and the kids from our children's program did some songs. And we planted a Queen Elizabeth rose in the Heritage Garden at that time. Sadly, that rose didn't survive. The hybrid tea roses don't do really well in that space. But we had our local MP planted the rose for that occasion. In September 2011, we did a major panel exhibit on David Thompson. That was the 200th anniversary of his trip in this area, like past the site of Revelstoke and to boat encampment. So we did that exhibit. That was in the hallway downstairs that no longer exists. So when we removed that hallway, we brought that exhibit up here. It was in this room for a while and now in the hallway. And that was, I think that began our tradition of getting Jose at Modern Bake Shop to make themed cakes for us. So this was our David Thompson cake that had Jello Rapids on it. We launched our first tracks book in fall of 2011 on ski history, and that same year installed the first tracks exhibition. And this is Catherine Whiteside, who was the exhibit designer. In May of 2013, the board held a 30th anniversary tea party for me. And then we opened an exhibit called Mosaic up here from 2013 till 2018. And that's photographs of that exhibit that we replaced with the current exhibit on, called Stories Beneath the Surface in 2018. So in 2013, we had money to do some major renovations. So this is the main floor exhibit area before renovations, during renovations, and after renovations. So we had new flooring put in, we had new lighting put in. They painted the ceiling panels white, and just took out all the interior, the walls down there, like where that hallway used to be, and just opened up the space to what we have now. And that's when we really started moving towards more panel exhibits. I was still sort of putting things up on the wall with, just with sticky tack, photographs and text. But then we started getting proper panels made and moved into where we are now. We also, that same year, 2013, we had money to work on our storage area downstairs. So this was one room downstairs that I used to call the hellhole, because we just had lots of stuff in there. This shows it after it had been emptied out. And we had 3 rooms downstairs, which was our storage for our small artifacts. And you can see it's just stuff crammed onto wooden shelves. And things, we didn't have location codes. We just kind of had things vaguely sorted by theme. But we went from that to this. So now these shelves are all full with the contents of those 3 rooms got into one room, because we had the rolling shelving that you can create just a hallway as where you need it, but it really saves a lot of space. So it was it's really brilliant. Even several years, 10 years later, I still get excited when I go downstairs and see that storage. It just made such a huge difference for a collection. We did a major exhibit on World War One between 2014 and 2019, the centennial years of the First World War, and launched Land of Thundering Snow in 2015 as an exhibit downstairs, which is still there, and a website, landofthanderingsnow.ca, on Digital Museums Canada. And then in 2020, we launched a traveling version of that exhibit, and it's been to Whistler, Salmon Arm, Fernie, Stewart, Prince George, and has just gone to Britannia Beach Museum and has several other venues. So we're getting that message out to a bigger audience now. This was our first little efforts at an exhibit on the Sinaiacs. Laura Stovall did a temporary exhibit up here. That's when we were really just sort of coming into knowledge about the Sinaiacs history in this area. And so that, with a lot of work and a lot of consultation with the Sinaiacs, who are part of the Colville Confederated Tribes, we created the exhibit that we have now that opened in 2016. In 2017, it was the 100th anniversary of women in BC getting the vote. So we did a suffragette tea to celebrate that history. And that was a lot of fun. That was when we had some local actors who were portraying both sides of the argument. This fellow down here is a preacher who is preaching against the evils of women having the vote. And the other one shouting him, trying to shout him down. So that was a lot of fun. We also got some money to do a large artifact storage project in 2018. So again, we have the rolling shelves and some good cases, shelving for our large artifacts. So that happened in 2018. Getting control of our collection, and then in both is such a huge part of being able to maintain a proper museum. And about 12, 13 years ago, we went from the paper system that I was explaining that Mary and the others used. In about 2000, we created our own database using Microsoft Access. And then about 2011 or so, we purchased a collections management software program called Past Perfect, which we still use now. The Railway Museum uses it, the Forestry Museum, a lot of sort of medium, small size museums use it. So it's just a brilliant way of keeping track of our collections. So that's a really important part of a museum. People don't see that part, but we can't operate unless we've got good control of our collections, and we were able to do that. And with Mandy here, who has training in conservation, we're going to be able to look at, if there's any pieces in our collection that are at risk, and to be able to come up with a plan to handle that. So as I say, it's not the obvious part of a museum, but it's really an important part, and it's part that I really get excited about, knowing that we've been able to make those strides in our collections management. And then our gift shop opened in 2008 and is still doing well. And we're doing more things all the time. We're always coming up with more ideas. We're currently working on an exhibit that'll go on the walls in this room called Reclaimed Voices, where we're going to find ways to tell stories that aren't as obvious as some of the usual ones, like stories about the Japanese community, about women's history. So we're just in the early stages of putting that one together. We're doing a online version of Stories Beneath the Surface that should be hopefully up by the end of this year on Digital Museums Canada. So we've always got things in the works, and it's really been in the last 20 years that we've really expanded into programming as well. Rather than just having people come in and sort of passively enjoy the museum, where we've become more active, and so we get like lots of school tours in, brown bag history that's been going for 20 years, and other programming and events that we do. So And I've been here for 40 years of that. So it's been a lot of fun for me. My last talk this fall will be on my 40 years. So that one will be all about me. So I'm sure you can't wait for that one. Um, thanks for coming today. We'll see you in 2 weeks for the history of Manning's, which started out as a candy store and ended up as a Chinese restaurant. So thanks again for coming today. Let me just stop the recording.